In February of the year 1258, the Mongol army under Hulagu Khan entered the city of Baghdad and began to destroy it. They burned the mosques. They took the life of the caliph by wrapping him in a carpet and trampling him with horses, a method the Mongols preferred for the execution of royalty because it avoided the spilling of royal blood on the ground. They took the life of somewhere between 200,000 and 800,000 people. The estimates vary, as estimates from catastrophes of this scale always vary, because the people who might have counted the dead were among the dead, and they burned the libraries. Baghdad in 1258 was the intellectual capital of the known world. It had been, for 500 years, the city where knowledge came to be gathered, copied, translated, studied, and debated. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, had been the greatest library and research institution in human history. It held manuscripts collected from across the Islamic world and beyond, Greek philosophy translated into Arabic, Indian mathematics that would later reach Europe as algebra, Persian astronomy, Chinese paper-making techniques, medical treatises from every tradition the Islamic scholars had encountered in 5 centuries of extraordinary intellectual expansion. When the Mongols finished, the Tigris River ran black with ink for days. That detail appears in multiple contemporary accounts, which is why historians take it seriously despite its almost mythological quality. The ink of all those manuscripts dissolved in the water of the river that had run alongside the city of learning for 5 centuries. Take a moment with that image. The Tigris running black with ink. Everything that had been written, everything that had been thought and recorded and copied and preserved dissolving into the water. Not burned to ash, which is violent and fast, but diluted into the river, spreading and thinning and fading until there is nothing left. That is what the end of a library looks like when you describe it honestly. But not everything burned, not everything dissolved, because someone had been paying attention. Someone had understood, weeks or months before the Mongols arrived, what was coming. And that person, whose name we know, whose actions we can partially reconstruct, whose motives we can only guess at, had done something that required enormous courage and an even more enormous love of books. He had hidden them. This is the story of Ibn Wasil, and the manuscripts he carried into the dark before the city burned, and the question that has occupied historians ever since. How many books did he save? And where are they now? Baghdad was not an ancient city. It was a planned one, built from scratch on the banks of the Tigris in 762 AD by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, who chose the site with the precision of a man who understood that geography was destiny. The location was almost perfect. The Tigris to the east, the Euphrates close enough to connect by canal, the surrounding farmland among the most productive in the world, the trade routes between east and west passing through or near the site. Al-Mansur called his new city Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace. The world would come to know it simply as Baghdad. What made Baghdad extraordinary was not its location, though the location was excellent. What made it extraordinary was a series of decisions made by successive caliphs over several generations to make it the place where knowledge was collected. The Abbasid Caliphate inherited the conquests of the early Islamic expansion and found itself ruling a world of extraordinary cultural diversity. Egypt, Persia, Syria, Mesopotamia, parts of Central Asia, all of these territories had their own intellectual traditions, their own libraries, their own scholars working in their own languages on their own problems. The Abbasids could have ignored all of this, could have focused only on Arabic and Islamic learning and left the rest to slowly disappear. Instead, they did something that was, in historical terms, almost unprecedented in its ambition. They decided to translate everything. Beginning in the late 8th century and continuing through the 9th and into the 10th, the Abbasid Caliphate funded one of the most extraordinary translation projects in human history. Scholars were hired, at considerable expense, to translate into Arabic the accumulated intellectual heritage of Greece, Persia, India, and whatever other civilizations could be reached and whose texts could be obtained. Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Galen, Hippocrates, the mathematical texts of India that introduced the concept of zero to the Arabic-speaking world and, through Arabic, to Europe. Persian astronomical tables, Syriac medical knowledge. The translation project was not merely passive, it was active, acquisitive, willing to pay significant sums for manuscripts that were brought from distant places by merchants and travelers who understood that there was a market for old books in Baghdad. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the Caliph of the 1001 Nights, though the real man was considerably more complex than the literary figure funded early phases of this work. His son al-Mamun established the House of Wisdom as a formal institution, a combination of library, translation bureau, and research center, staffed by some of the greatest scholars of the age. Al-Mamun reportedly dreamed of Aristotle and spent the rest of his life trying to acquire as much of Aristotle's work as could be found in the world. He sent delegations to Byzantium to purchase Greek manuscripts. He offered the weight of a manuscript in gold for significant texts. The House of Wisdom grew. Baghdad grew. By the 9th century, the city had a population of somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, one of the largest cities in the world at that time, possibly the largest. It had hundreds of bookshops. It had paper mills. Because the technology of papermaking had arrived from China via the Silk Road, and the availability of cheap, high-quality paper had transformed the economics of manuscript production. Books that had once taken months to copy on expensive parchment could now be produced in weeks on paper. The intellectual life of the city was extraordinary. Mathematicians invented algebra. The word itself is Arabic, from al-Jabr, the title of a treatise by the 9th century mathematician al-Khwarizmi. Astronomers mapped the stars with precision that would not be improved upon for centuries, and gave those stars Arabic names that are still in use today: Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Rigel. Physicians developed surgical techniques and pharmaceutical knowledge that represented significant advances over anything available in contemporary Europe. Philosophers debated questions about the nature of knowledge, the relationship between reason and revelation, the structure of the physical world. All of this was written down. All of it was copied in the thousands of scriptoriums and bookshops and private libraries that the city supported. The manuscripts accumulated. The libraries grew. Think about what it would mean to live in a city where knowledge was the primary industry, where the most valued profession was scholarship, where the currency of prestige was not land or armies, but access to rare texts and the ability to understand them. Baghdad at its height was that city. It was, for 500 years, the place where the accumulated intellectual heritage of the ancient world was not merely preserved, but actively extended, built upon, corrected, debated, synthesized with the learning of other traditions. It was the nearest thing the medieval world had to a university city, and it was magnificent. By the 13th century, when the events of this story take place, Baghdad had been the intellectual capital of the Islamic world for 500 years. The House of Wisdom had grown, changed, survived political upheavals, and continued to accumulate manuscripts. There were other great libraries in the Islamic world in Cairo, in Cordoba, in Samarkand, but Baghdad was the center, the place that the others referenced and deferred to. The physical library of the House of Wisdom is difficult to reconstruct from surviving accounts. We know it was large. We know it contained manuscripts on virtually every subject known to medieval scholarship. We know that it employed a permanent staff of librarians, copyists, and scholars who maintained the collection and continued to add to it. We know that access was relatively open, that scholars who could demonstrate their credentials and their seriousness could come and read, and that the caliph's patronage of learning was genuine enough that the institution functioned as something more than a private royal collection. What we do not know, and what we will never know, is exactly how many manuscripts it contained. The estimates range from several 100,000 to several million volumes. These numbers are almost certainly exaggerated. The tendency of medieval chroniclers to make their cities and their institutions seem as large and impressive as possible is well documented, but even a fraction of the larger estimates would represent an almost inconceivable accumulation of human knowledge. And all of it, or almost all of it, was about to be destroyed. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but the empire he had built did not die with him. His sons and grandsons continued the expansion, driving westward and southward into territories that had no precedent for the kind of warfare the Mongols brought. The Mongol military system was unlike anything the Islamic world had encountered. It combined extraordinary mobility, the ability to cover ground at speeds that cavalry-based armies of the period could not match with a systematic approach to siege warfare that the nomadic peoples of the steppe had. Developed in the century since Genghis Khan had first unified them, they were patient, they were organized, they had learned, from the Chinese engineers they had conquered earlier, how to break city walls, and they had developed, as a deliberate policy, the use of terror as a military instrument. Cities that surrendered without resistance were often spared, or spared relatively. Cities that resisted were destroyed comprehensively, their populations executed, their buildings razed, their irrigation systems deliberately broken so that the agricultural land around them would revert to steppe to the kind of landscape the Mongols understood and preferred. The destruction was not random. It was strategic. It was intended to send a message to the next city and the city after that. The message was received. City after city, as the Mongol armies moved west through Central Asia and into Persia, made the calculation that surrender was preferable to resistance. Some of them were right. Some were wrong. The Mongols' definition of acceptable resistance was narrow, and their patience with negotiation was limited. By the 1250s, the Mongol advance had reached the eastern borders of the Abbasid Caliphate. The caliph in Baghdad was al-Mustasim, a man whose qualities as a ruler were, by most accounts, not equal to the moment. He was not incompetent in ordinary times, but ordinary times were over. He was cautious where boldness was required, optimistic where realism was necessary, and he seems to have genuinely believed, until very late, that Baghdad's status as the spiritual and intellectual center of the Islamic world would protect it, that even the Mongols would hesitate before the seat of the caliphate. He was wrong. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, was given command of the Western campaign in 1253. He was, by the standards of Mongol leadership, a man of some cultural sophistication. His mother and his primary wife were Nestorian Christians, and he had a personal interest in astronomy and philosophy that distinguished him from the purely military commanders who had preceded him in this role. This did not make him merciful, but it meant that he understood at some level what he was approaching when he moved toward Baghdad. The campaign began formally in 1257. Hulagu sent emissaries to al-Mustasim demanding submission. The negotiations that followed were fruitless. The caliph's advisors were divided. His military commanders were divided. And al-Mustasim himself could not bring himself to either submit fully or resist comprehensively. He procrastinated. He sent partial responses. He hoped that the Mongols would be satisfied with something less than total submission, or that some other political development would intervene. The Mongols were not interested in partial responses. In January 1258, the army crossed the Euphrates and began its approach to Baghdad. The caliph's army engaged them outside the city and was defeated. The Mongol forces surrounded the city and began the systematic reduction of its defenses. Baghdad held for approximately 3 weeks. It was not enough. 3 weeks. The city had stood for 500 years. It had been, for most of those 500 years, the most important city in the Islamic world. And it held for 3 weeks against what was coming for it. Put yourself, for a moment, inside those 3 weeks. You are a scholar in Baghdad. You know the Mongols are at the walls. You know what they have done to other cities. You know what is in the libraries around you. What do you do? The question of what the scholars and librarians of Baghdad knew, and when they knew it, is one that historians have examined carefully, because it bears directly on the question of what they did. The Mongol approach had been visible for months before the siege began. The campaign of 1257 was well known throughout the region. Refugees from earlier Mongol conquests had been arriving in Baghdad for years, bringing first-hand accounts of what the destruction of a major city looked like. The fate of Samarkand, of Nishapur, of Merv cities that had been among the great centers of Islamic civilization in Central Asia, and that the Mongols had reduced to rubble and ash, was known in Baghdad. The ink-black river was not something that could have been entirely unexpected by the people who had the information to think carefully about what was coming. Some people fled. The outflow of scholars and manuscripts from Baghdad in the years and months before the siege is documented, imperfectly, in the records of the libraries and institutions that received them. Scholars arrived in Cairo, in Anatolia, in the courts of rulers in Syria and Persia, carrying their knowledge and, in some cases, their books. The diaspora of Baghdad's intellectual life began before the city fell. But most people stayed. Most people, in most historical catastrophes, stay. The reasons are various: attachment to place, skepticism about the danger, inability to move, the weight of everything that cannot be carried. The scholars of Baghdad, for the most part, stayed in their city and continued their work and hoped, as people always hope, that the worst would not come to pass. The worst came to pass. His full name was Jamal al-Din Muhammad ibn Salim ibn Nasr ibn Wasil al-Hamawi. He was born around 1,208 inches, the city of Hama in Syria, into a family of scholars and administrators that had been part of the intellectual life of the Islamic world for generations. His father was a judge, a qadi, and his grandfather before him. The law and the life of the mind were, for the Ibn Wasil family, essentially the same thing. He came to Baghdad as a young man to study, as the best students of his generation came to Baghdad to study, because Baghdad was where the best teachers were and where the best libraries were, and where a serious scholar could find, in any field he chose, the resources he needed. He studied jurisprudence, the Islamic legal tradition, and mathematics and logic and philosophy. He was, by all the accounts that survive, a prodigious student with a particular gift for synthesizing different intellectual traditions, for finding the connections between the legal reasoning of Islamic jurisprudence and the logical frameworks of Aristotelian philosophy. He was also, from early in his career, a diplomat. This combination, the scholarly mind and the political skill, would define his life. He served as an ambassador, at various points, for the Ayyubid rulers of Syria. He spent time at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in Palermo. Frederick was one of the most intellectually curious rulers of his age, a man who collected scholars the way other rulers collected jewels, and who was genuinely interested in the Arabic philosophical tradition that Ibn Wasil represented. The encounter between these two men, the Syrian scholar and the Sicilian emperor, meeting in the middle of the Mediterranean in the 1260s, is one of the more remarkable intellectual encounters of the medieval period. Ibn Wasil wrote. He wrote extensively. His major historical work, Mufarraj al-Kurub fi Akbar Bani Ayyub, which translates roughly as the dissipator of anxieties, concerning the history of the Ayyubid dynasty, is one of the most important sources for the history of the Ayyubid period, and it survives. Manuscripts of it exist in several libraries in the world today, which is part of what makes Ibn Wasil's story so poignant. He spent his life writing about others. He is known because other people wrote about him, and because what he did in Baghdad left traces in the historical record that his own modesty or the destruction of his personal papers did not erase. By 1258, Ibn Wasil was in his late 40s or early 50s. He had been, for a significant period, working in or associated with the libraries of Baghdad. The specific nature of his role is not entirely clear from the surviving sources, but he appears to have had access to the collections at a level that suggests something more than a visiting scholar. He knew where things were. He knew what things were worth saving. He also had, by this point in his life, a network. Decades of travel and diplomacy and scholarship had given him connections throughout the Islamic world and beyond it, connections that would matter enormously in the months ahead. He knew people in Cairo. He knew people in Syria. He knew, in the broad sense of knowing, that comes from a lifetime of movement through the courts and academies of the medieval world, where manuscripts could be sent to be safe. The question is when he began. When did Ibn Wasil look at the situation and conclude that Baghdad was going to fall, and that the libraries were going to burn, and that the only way to save any of it was to act before the Mongols arrived? The historical record does not give us a precise date. What it gives us, in the accounts of later scholars who wrote about what Ibn Wasil had done, is a description of the action itself, that he had hidden manuscripts, that he had moved them out of the libraries to locations where they would survive the destruction, that he had done this before the siege began or in its early stages when movement within and out of the city was still possible. The locations mentioned in the accounts vary. Some say cellars. The word used suggests underground storage, the kind of place that might survive the burning of buildings above it. Some suggest that manuscripts were also moved outside the city, to trusted individuals in other locations, through the network of contacts that Ibn Wasil had built over a lifetime. We do not know what it felt like to make this decision. We do not have letters or diary entries or any document in which Ibn Wasil explains himself, but we can reconstruct the situation he faced. The city was surrounded. The outcome was becoming clear. The libraries around him contained manuscripts that represented centuries of accumulated human knowledge that existed in some cases in single copies, manuscripts for which no other exemplar was known to exist anywhere in the world. If the city burned, and the libraries burned, that knowledge would be gone, not suppressed, not hidden, gone. The specific texture of a human mind that had worked through a problem and arrived at an insight and written it down gone, as if it had never existed. And there was something he could do about it. Not everything. He could not save everything. The collections were too large. The time was too short. The logistics of moving thousands of heavy manuscripts were too difficult. But he could save some. He could choose with the judgment of a scholar who understood what he was looking at, which manuscripts were unique, which were most at risk, which represented knowledge that existed nowhere else. That act of choosing is itself remarkable. In a moment of catastrophe, when the rational response might have been to flee with whatever he could carry, Ibn Wasil appears to have approached the problem with the systematic attention of a librarian. He was triaging a library, deciding what could be lost and what could not, making the terrible calculation that some books could be replaced and some could not, and acting on that calculation under conditions of extreme urgency and danger. A library is not a building. A library is a decision, made by someone who understood what mattered, to keep what was worth keeping. Ibn Wasil made that decision twice, once over a lifetime of scholarship and once in the final weeks of a burning city. Baghdad fell on the 10th of February, 1258. The Caliph al-Mustasim surrendered personally to Hulagu Khan and was executed shortly afterward in the Mongol fashion. The killing of the Caliph, the commander of the faithful, the spiritual successor to the Prophet, the figure whose authority underpinned the political structure of the entire Sunni Islamic world, was an event of such enormous symbolic significance that its effects were felt for centuries. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had existed in one form or another for 500 years, ended on that day. The sack of the city lasted approximately a week. The killing was systematic. The Mongols were organized about it, as they were organized about everything. There were categories of people who were spared: Nestorian Christians, because of Hulagu's family connections; foreign merchants, for economic reasons; scholars who could be useful. The last category is significant. Hulagu was not simply destroying Baghdad. He was, in a complicated way, partly appropriating it, taking the scholars who had survived, particularly the astronomers and mathematicians, into his own service. The libraries burned. Not all at once. A city the size of Baghdad does not burn all at once. But the great libraries, the public collections, the House of Wisdom itself, these were destroyed. The accounts of what happened to the manuscripts are consistent enough in their general outline to be credible, even if the specific details vary. That manuscripts were thrown into the Tigris, that others were burned, that the ink ran in the water for days afterward. The specific phrase that recurs in the sources, "the river running black with ink," appears in the work of several historians writing in the century after the event, drawing on accounts from people who had been present or had spoken to people who had been present. It has the quality of a detail that was too specific and too strange to be invented, the kind of image that sticks in memory because it makes the abstract concrete. The destruction of a library is an abstraction. Ink in the water is not. The question of what was lost in the burning of Baghdad's libraries is one that scholars have been trying to answer for 7 centuries, and the honest answer is that we will never know completely. We know what we still have. We know the texts that survived, either because they had already been copied to other locations before 1258, or because copies made after 1258 from surviving manuscripts preserved at least some portion of the tradition. The great works of the Greek philosophical and scientific tradition, Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, Ptolemy, survived in Arabic translation because they had been copied widely enough that no single catastrophe could destroy all exemplars. The major works of Islamic jurisprudence and theology survived for the same reason. The Quran, which had been copied millions of times across the entire Islamic world, was never at risk. What we lost is harder to know precisely because we do not know what we lost. We have references in surviving texts to works that are mentioned but not quoted from texts that scholars had read and discussed, but whose physical manuscripts did not survive the burning. There are citations in surviving works that lead nowhere because the cited text no longer exists. There are descriptions of scientific discoveries and mathematical proofs that sound, from their descriptions, like they might have represented significant advances, but whose contents we cannot verify because the original works are gone. The astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who was working for the Mongols by the time of the Baghdad sack, reportedly saved some manuscripts by taking them to his observatory at Maraga in northwestern Iran. The extent of this salvage is disputed. Other scholars, fleeing before or after the destruction, carried what they could. Cairo, which had remained outside Mongol control, received a significant influx of both scholars and manuscripts in the years after 1258. And the Fatimid Library, there already one of the great collections of the Islamic world, was enriched by what arrived from Baghdad. But much was lost. Perhaps most. The specific magnitude of the loss is unknowable, which is itself a kind of loss. Not knowing what you do not know is a particular form of intellectual poverty that the burning of Baghdad imposed on all subsequent scholarship. And then there was the cellar. The accounts that describe what Ibn Wasil did use different words for the location. Some say underground storage. Some say a secure location within the city. Some suggest that manuscripts were moved to private houses, hidden among domestic objects, disguised as things that would not attract the attention of soldiers looking for valuables. The number of manuscripts mentioned in the various accounts also varies. Some say hundreds, some say thousands. The word that appears in several accounts is simply kutub books. He saved books. He hid books. The books survived. What is consistent across the accounts is the outcome, that manuscripts which should not have survived the burning of Baghdad did survive, and that their survival was attributed to Ibn Wasil's intervention. Later scholars, writing about texts they had encountered that they knew had come from the Baghdad collections, sometimes noted their provenance, noted that these were texts that had been in the House of Wisdom, that had survived the Mongol destruction, that had reached them through a chain of transmission that included the catastrophe of 1258 without being destroyed by it. Those notes in the margins of manuscripts, scholars across the Islamic world, writing in the decades and centuries after 1258, noting where a particular text had come from, are part of the evidence that historians use to reconstruct what Ibn Wasil did. The manuscript itself becomes the testimony. The survival of a text that should not have survived, traced back to Baghdad, traced back to a collection that was supposedly destroyed, is evidence of someone's action in the weeks before the burning. This is what a library actually is, when you follow it to its conclusion. Not a building, not a catalog, but a set of decisions made by real people under real conditions, often desperate conditions, to carry something forward. Every manuscript that survived the burning of Baghdad survived because a human being picked it up and carried it. Ibn Wasil may have been the most systematic and deliberate of those human beings, but he was not alone. Every scholar who left with books, every merchant who carried a manuscript he did not fully understand, every soldier who was superstitious enough to leave the books alone, all of them contributed to what survived. Ibn Wasil survived the fall of Baghdad. This much is clear from the historical record. He continued to write, continued to travel, continued to function as a scholar and diplomat in the decades after 1258. His history of the Ayyubid dynasty was completed after the Baghdad catastrophe. He lived to write about what he had witnessed. He went to Egypt. This was the natural destination for a scholar of his connections, and his generation Egypt had remained outside the Mongol conquest. And Cairo under the Mamluk sultans was becoming the new center of Islamic intellectual life, absorbing the diaspora of scholars and manuscripts from the destroyed cities of the East. Ibn Wasil arrived there carrying knowledge, and perhaps carrying manuscripts, and perhaps carrying information about where more manuscripts could be found in whatever cellars and hiding places his foresight had created. The Cairo that received him was a city in the process of transformation. The Mamluks, the military slave caste who had seized power from the Ayyubids, and who would, in 1260, defeat the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut and prevent the westward expansion of the empire, were energetic patrons of learning. The libraries of Cairo grew in the decades after 1258, fed by the influx of manuscripts from the east and by the deliberate policy of the Mamluk sultans who understood that intellectual prestige was a form of political power. Ibn Wasil lived until approximately 1298, dying in his late 80s or early 90s, an extraordinary age for the period. He had outlived the fall of Baghdad by 40 years. He had outlived the first generation of the Mongol destruction and seen the beginning of the Mongol adaptation, the gradual conversion of the Mongol rulers of Persia to Islam, the slow reconstruction of the intellectual life that the conquest had disrupted. He had been, in the broadest sense, a survivor. And survival, for a scholar of his type, meant continuing to transmit, to pass on, to copy, to teach, to connect what had been with what would come after. In the centuries after 1258, manuscripts continued to surface in libraries across the Islamic world that could be traced through their marginalia and their provenance chains back to the Baghdad collections. The library of the Süleymaniye Mosque complex in Istanbul, built by the Ottoman sultans as they became the new great patrons of Islamic scholarship, received, over several centuries, manuscripts whose origins pointed back to Baghdad, the great libraries of Cairo, the collections in Tehran and Mashhad and Qom that grew under successive Persian dynasties, the Bodleian Library in Oxford and the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and the Vatican Library, all of which acquired Islamic manuscripts through a complex web of purchases and donations that stretched across centuries. Some of these collections contain manuscripts that can be traced imperfectly through the long chain of survival that began with someone's decision to hide something in the weeks before the burning. The provenance chains are the detective work. A manuscript that contains a note in a 14th century hand saying that it was acquired from a library in Cairo that had received it from a scholar who had it from Baghdad. That chain, even broken, even partial, even uncertain, points toward the original act of preservation. The further back you can trace a manuscript, the more likely you are, eventually, to find Baghdad at the beginning of the chain. Scholars have been doing this work for generations, and they continue to do it. The technical term is codicology, the study of manuscripts as physical objects, of the hands that copied them, the materials they were made from, the annotations and ownership marks they accumulated over centuries of transmission. Codicology is, in its own way, a form of archaeology, the careful excavation of a physical object to recover the history embedded in it. Every manuscript that comes through this process and leads back to Baghdad is, in a sense, a confirmation of what someone did in February 1258. A small, physical, slightly miraculous confirmation that the decision to hide books rather than flee without them was the right decision. Today, historians estimate that somewhere between a quarter and a third of the manuscript heritage of the classical Islamic period has survived to the present day. The numbers are necessarily approximate. We do not know precisely how much existed before 1258, so we cannot calculate exactly what percentage of that we still have. What we do know is that what survived is extraordinary: the great works of Arabic mathematics and astronomy, the medical encyclopedias of Ibn Sina Avicenna that would reach Europe and form the basis of Western medical education for centuries, the philosophical works of Ibn Rushd Averroes that reintroduced Aristotle to medieval Europe through the medium of Arabic commentary and sparked the intellectual revolution that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. The poetry of al-Mutanabi and the prose of al-Jahiz and the geographical works of al-Idrisi, whose map of the world oriented south up, remained one of the most accurate depictions of the known world for centuries. These things survived, not because survival was inevitable, not because the manuscripts were indestructible, but because people made decisions, sometimes systematic decisions, like Ibn Wasil's, and sometimes individual decisions made in moments of fear or love or simple stubbornness to carry them forward. The book you are reading, if it is one of these works, is the last in a very long series of copies. Someone in the 9th century sat in Baghdad and copied it from an older exemplar. Someone in the 11th century copied that copy. Someone in the 13th century either carried a copy out of Baghdad before it burned, or lived somewhere else and made copies from manuscripts that had already traveled. Every hand that copied, every person who chose to carry rather than abandon, every librarian who hid something in a cellar rather than leaving it to burn, they are all, in a sense, The authors of the book you hold. Ibn Wasil is among them. Ibn Wasil is not a famous figure. He does not have a Wikipedia page in most languages. He does not appear in the popular histories of the Islamic Golden Age that fill the shelves of Western bookstores. He is known to specialists, to historians of the medieval Islamic world, to scholars of the Ayyubid period, to codicologists who trace the provenance of manuscripts but not to the general reader. This is partly because the history of the Islamic world in the medieval period is systematically underrepresented in the popular historical consciousness of the West, a bias that has been noted and criticized by scholars for decades. And that is slowly, unevenly being corrected. But it is also because of something specific to Ibn Wasil's case. He did not write about what he did. He did not leave a memoir of the Baghdad crisis, did not compose a treatise on the importance of preserving manuscripts, did not write letters to posterity explaining his actions and their significance. He did what he did, and then he continued his life writing, traveling, teaching, completing his history of the Ayyubid dynasty without, apparently, making a particular point of the preservation work. This is characteristic of a certain kind of person. The people who do necessary things in moments of crisis are not always the same people who write about those things afterward. The writing and the doing are different skills, and the temperament that drives one is not always the same temperament that drives the other. Ibn Wasil was, above all things, a scholar. He understood that what mattered was the manuscripts, not the story of how they were saved. The manuscripts were the point. He was the instrument. History remembers the destroyers more easily than the preservers. Hulagu Khan is in the history books. The man who hid the books before Hulagu arrived is harder to find. The story of Ibn Wasil opens onto a broader question that is worth sitting with, in the quiet of a late night or an early morning when the mind is receptive to large thoughts. What is a library for? The obvious answer is, access a library is for making knowledge available to people who need it. And this is true and important, and the reason libraries have been built and maintained by every advanced civilization in human history. But the act of preservation, the specific act that Ibn Wasil performed, and that every librarian and copyist and scholar performed in the centuries before and after 1258 points toward a different and deeper function. A library is a bet on the future. It is a decision, made in the present, that the knowledge it contains will be needed by someone who has not yet been born, in circumstances that cannot be predicted. The person who hides manuscripts in a cellar before a city burns is making a bet that the burning will not be permanent, that someone will come and dig them out, that the world that comes after the burning will want what was saved. That bet is not always won. Libraries have been destroyed that have never been reconstructed. Knowledge has been lost that has not been recovered. There are silences in the intellectual record where there should be voices, gaps in the history of human thought that no amount of scholarly detection has been able to fill. But the bet is also, often enough, won. The manuscripts that Ibn Wasil hid found their way, over decades and centuries, to libraries where scholars could use them. The translations that the scholars of Baghdad had made of Greek texts reached Europe through Spain and Sicily and contributed, in ways that are still being mapped by historians, to the intellectual revolution of the 12th and 13th centuries. The algebra of al-Khwarizmi became the algebra of European universities. The astronomy of the Baghdad scholars became the astronomy that Copernicus inherited when he began to think about the arrangement of the solar system. The knowledge survived, in sufficient quantity to matter, and it mattered. The bet was won. The Tigris still flows through Baghdad. The city still exists, though it has been destroyed and rebuilt many times since 1258, and the destruction it has experienced in the modern era would have been, in some ways, recognizable to the scholars who lived through the Mongol siege. The ruins of the House of Wisdom are not clearly identifiable. The archaeology of medieval Baghdad has been complicated by the continuous rebuilding of the city on the same site, and what lies beneath the modern city remains largely inaccessible. The manuscripts that Ibn Wasil saved are in libraries around the world. Some of them are digitized. The great manuscript libraries of Cairo and Istanbul and Tehran and Dublin and Paris and London and Washington have been engaged for the last 2 decades in a massive project to photograph and digitize their holdings, making available to anyone with an internet connection texts that were hidden in a Baghdad cellar in the winter of 1258, The physical objects, the paper and ink that a scholar's hands touched in the last weeks before his city burned, are being scanned, and the scans are being uploaded, and the knowledge they contain is becoming, for the first time in centuries, genuinely accessible. Ibn Wasil himself is buried somewhere in Egypt, probably in Cairo, in a grave that is not marked with anything that historians have been able to identify. He died an old man, 40 years after the burning. He left a history of the Ayyubid dynasty and a network of scholars who continued the transmission he had helped to preserve, and a series of manuscripts whose survival in circumstances that should have destroyed them is the most eloquent testimony to what he did. He did not write about the hiding of the books. He did not need to. The books speak for themselves, as books always do, for anyone who takes the trouble to listen. The next time you hold a book that is very old, or read a text that was written 1,000 years ago, consider what it took to get it to you. Not just the printing, not just the libraries, not just the digitization, but the long, fragile, improbable chain of human decisions that brought it through the fires and the floods and the wars and the simple passage of time. Someone, somewhere in that chain, made the decision to carry it forward rather than leave it behind. That person had a name. We do not always know it, but the fact that the book exists means the decision was made. The Tigris ran black with ink in February 1258, but not all of it. Some of the ink survived, in paper, in cellars, in the careful hands of a scholar who understood that a book was not just words on a page, but an argument across time, a voice insisting, against the evidence of the burning city, that what had been thought and written and known was worth carrying forward into whatever came next. Ibn Wasil carried it forward, and here, more than 700 years later, you are reading his answer.